Everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking with someone with an impressive lunchbox collection, is what
Ah,
I'm seeing here. Author, comics creator, writer, Mike MacLean. I said author and writer; those are like the same thing. Nevertheless,
yeah, it's
looks good.
actually my wife's lunchbox collection. She's known as what they call a boxer, and she loves lunchboxes. But it's interesting to see anybody that sees them; they just kind of go back to their childhood as soon as they see them. It's pretty fun.
100%, 100%. Now, I usually mention a couple of titles. You have work with Coffin Comics, Lady Death, La Muerta, Zack the Zombie Exterminator, and then you've also worked in the world of film. So I'm going to make sure that I pronounce these correctly.
Right.
Sharktopus, uh, Dino Croc versus Super Gator, and Operation Rogue being a few of
Yeah,
those. And then you also write in crime novel format. So you
yeah,
have,
short stories mostly. Yeah,
yeah, you have a range of approaches to writing, which I always find interesting.
yeah. I've been lucky to be able to work in these different areas. Not only screenwriting and comic, but I also write short stories. So it's been a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. So what among those, we'll talk a bit about each if you'd like, but curious about what led you to creating comics in particular.
Well, I'm a lifetime comic book fan since like the age of 7 or 8 years old. Always wanted to write comics, but growing up in Arizona, I noticed that comic books were always set in New York.
Hmm, hmm.
It was that's where the Marvel office was and the DC office was, and all the Marvel comics took place in New York. So the idea that I would ever become a comic book writer, they might have well been on the moon. I just thought that was kind of out of reach. Strangely enough, it seemed more realistic to become a screenwriter than a comic book writer because it just seems so far away. But yeah, I've always been interested in comics. I've loved them all my life. And thankfully, I got an opportunity to do it, and I jumped at it. So that's kind of where my interest came from.
Love it, love it. What's the approach like? How does it vary from working on screenwriting versus prose versus comics?
Well, it's surprisingly very different than screenwriting, which I was surprised at how you have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics when you're first writing comics, and which I was really surprised, like I said, because I'd been reading comics my whole life. To give you an example, what I mean in a screenwriting format, you can write man enters a bar, sees a pretty girl in the end of the bar, walks across the room, grabs a flower from a vase and gives her the flower. Obviously it'd be a little more efficient than that, but you could write that in a scene.
Hmm.
Well, in a comic book, that could be 3 pages, and those pages are valuable real estate, especially in the indie market. That that's pretty expensive to come up with 3 pages just to give a person a flower. So when you're writing comic books, you really have to focus on the snapshots that tell the whole story. So it's almost as much as what you leave out is as important as what you're writing in there. So it was a really interesting process to try to figure out what are the most interesting, most dramatic shots, and it has to be sensical. So when you're going from one panel to the next, the audience has to be able to visually follow you, or else there can be some confusion there. So you have to make sure that you have those transitions from one panel to the next. So it's actually very different from screenwriting. We kind of equate them because they're both visual mediums, but I believe that it's a different mindset that you have to have for comic book writing.
Yeah, really interesting to think about and what you could do on a page versus on the screen.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember discovering Brian Pulido's work in the 90s with Evil Ernie, Lady Death. And so I'm curious what connecting with Brian and what collaborating has allowed you to do creatively that way.
Yeah, I'm connecting with Brian, and don't do this at home, but quite frankly, I stalked him. At that point, I had already been working for Roger Corman, and we can get into that later, but I've been working for Roger Corman writing screenplays. And Brian actually works in the film industry as well. He had a film on the Sci-Fi Channel where many of the movies that I wrote were on. So I wanted to touch base with him because he lives in Arizona as well. And so I thought he would be a good contact to have. But in the back of my mind, it was always, there's a chance I could write comic books too, which has kind of been a lifelong dream. It's funny because you hear a lot of these news stories about comic book writers are really into it just to so that they can work their way into the movie industry. I
Hmm.
kind of did it backwards. I wanted to get into comics. So I got my door through comics was through the movie industry. So I just simply approached Brian at a con and gave my card to his lovely wife, and we set up a meeting and we just clicked really well. So that was how I met him. The way that we approach writing, I co-write pretty much everything with Brian, all the scripts, and it's a lot of fun. We just basically hash it out. We hash out an outline together. And then we kind of talk about, where we want to take the story and what specific incidents we want to have in the story. And after that meeting, one of us takes the lead on writing an outline, and then we'll pass the outline back and forth. And then one of us will take the lead on writing the first draft of the script, and then we'll pass the script back and forth. So it's a really interesting collaborative effort. And because Brian and I, even though we're very similar, we have different approaches. He's much more of a big story guy, and I think I'm a smaller story guy. So I think he really kind of helps me with these giant, dramatic, epic stories that we have in Lady Death.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned having fun there and creating. I imagine that working for Roger Corman was indeed a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. I almost I hate to tell people and burst their bubble. It was not very glamorous in any way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And strangely enough, I worked for Roger for probably 2.5 years before I even met him.
Yeah.
We talked over the phone and um, discussed things via email. So I wrote like 3 or 4 scripts without ever, face to face meeting the man.
Yeah.
So I don't know how usual that is. I think that's probably a little more usual in the indie market, but yeah, that was my first experience. Yeah, it was great working with Roger. It was a lot of fun. Um, it, you know, the it, I always say I wrote a movie called Sharktopus,
Hmm.
and one of
Hmm.
the best things about writing Sharktopus is when you tell people that you wrote Sharktopus, they tend to believe you because who's going to lie about that? And I make a lot of comments making fun of those movies, but to be honest, I'm very proud of them. I had a blast writing them. I really enjoyed working with Roger and Julie Corman. They were great to work with. I don't really have any negatives to say about that experience. He will be missed, and he is he made a huge impact on Hollywood and the film industry in general.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And those are just fun to watch and enjoy. And you seem to be a person who enjoys both science fiction and crime storytelling
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, I'm very much into crime fiction. That was my entry into getting a screenwriting gig. To be honest, I wrote a short story years ago called McHenry's Gift, and I was lucky enough to get that short story accepted into what they call the Best American Mystery Stories, which is an anthology. And if you're getting into an anthology, that's the one you want to get into because it was my short story next to basically my literary icons.
Hmm.
The people that I really looked up to, Elmore Leonard, James Lee Burke, all these huge names in the crime fiction world. So my story was in the same book as theirs. And
Cool.
then the way it happened was simply I got an email one day, and somebody from Roger Corman's office, their story editor, just said, "Hey, we really enjoyed this story. We wondered if you'd be interested in writing screenplays." And that's basically how it happened. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, and it's, when people ask, everybody asks, "Hey, what's your break-in story?" It's like everybody's break-in story into the industry is different. There's not one way to break in. You kind of make your own luck by putting your work out there. So I was lucky enough that somebody recognized that story and they gave me a shot writing screenplays, and they must have liked my work because they kept hiring me over and over, and had a lot of fun doing that.
Cool, cool. Very cool. Yeah. In terms of craft and plotting, I imagine with a crime story, a mystery, you have to have a certain number of beats, a certain amount of planning. Is that different in some ways, plotting wise, from science fiction?
You know, I don't think so. I think a story is a story, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
That's a cheesy answer, but beginning, middle, and end. You're going to have everything's got to come to a conclusion. I'm always, looking for something that's very satisfying for the author at the end. Um, so in terms of structure and process, I don't think there's really much difference. If between writing short stories, sci-fi and fiction. Now, writing a screenplay and writing short fiction, definitely a huge difference in process. Um, a writing screenplay you have to really plan it out, and that's true of writing comic books as well. You have to come up with an outline or a synopsis, and then that's accepted, and so you have to have the entire work really mapped out so you know exactly where you're going. I know there's some people that try to write a screenplay, they call pantsers or whatever you want to call them, that write it on the seat by the seat of their pants, but it's really difficult to do that because you're going to have to do a lot of rewriting.
Yeah.
In the low budget world, there's simply no time for that. There's like you mentioned Operation Rogue. They had me rewrite that a few times, and because they kept changing things. So the movie that you see is basically a first draft. Because I basically rewrote the script 3 times. And so the movie that you see there is a first draft. So that's an example of, you have to have the entire thing mapped out because there's simply no time for you to kind of go back. Oh, I want to change this scene or that scene. Um, so very different process in terms of writing short fiction. Short fiction, you can, have an idea and then just kind of work your way through it mentally. And that could be a lot of fun, but have to have a plan with when other people's money is at stake.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, you've created across these different approaches and different ways of storytelling. What would you like to do next creatively? Is there anything on the way that you'd like to mention?
I'm really enjoying what I'm doing now, working with Brian on the comics.
Hmm. Hmm.
And some of those comic books, we are working together to write screenplays for them. Basically, changing them into screenplays, and we're gonna shop those around. So I get to scratch the screenplay itch doing that. In addition, and it'll probably take me forever. I'm writing a crime novel. I've never finished a novel that's worth reading. Like in my younger days, I wrote 300 pages. I don't know if I'd call it a novel, and should not be read by anyone. But that's important to go through that process. So I'm on the back end when I have time. I'm writing kind of an unconventional crime novel about Arizona in the 70s. But that probably will not come to fruition for 10 years, to be honest, because it's so piecemeal. So that I do that on my own, to kind of scratch that itch of writing longer set prose. So I'm really fortunate that I get to work on all these different areas, and I feel that, with these amazing artists, it's so fun to see how they kind of bring the words to life, and it's a thrill every time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you have a website. Are there spaces where you like to connect with people online, in person? If I'm
Um,
someone out there who's interested in learning more.
Yeah, I mean, my website, I have not tended to it very often, to be honest. You can connect with me there, or Facebook. It's a good place to reach me. I'm not too active on Twitter. To look at my work, the coffincomics.com is a good place to find a lot of my comic book work. But really, Facebook is a good place to connect with me. And if you throw me a friend request, I usually will accept, as long as you're not sketchy. Yeah, that's usually where people can connect. On July 12th is coming Friday. I'm not sure what date this is going to be posted, but on July 12th, we have the closing of our Kickstarter for Lady Gunfighter, who is it's a Wild West comic with a supernatural edge. It was a lot of fun. It's drawn by Joel Gomez, and written by myself and Brian Pulido. At the colors by a young man named Hedwin Zalvadar. I'm hoping I'm not destroying his last name. And so that closes up on Friday, and we're really excited about that. It's done really well on Kickstarter, above our expectations. And then on, I believe it's August. Yeah, and then coming in August, another Kickstarter we're launching. It's going to be for Lady Death, called Eternal Sabbath. And that's, again, written by myself and Mr. Pulido, and drawn by Diego Bernard, who is a phenomenal artist and from Brazil. One of the best sequential artists working, and I get to say that even though I might have bias. He definitely is one of the best sequential, just like Joel. And then in later in August, the 30, let me check my dates. Yeah, the end of August up to September 1st, from the 30th to September 1st, I'll be at Tucson Comic-Con. And I'm going to be doing, last year I did all the panels. I was the moderator for all the panels, so that I probably will be doing most of the panels again this year. So if you're in the Tucson area, it's a great convention. It's a smaller convention. It's big enough where you get the excitement of a big convention, but it's smaller where you can kind of get a little more one-on-one time with some of the creators, and it's very comic book focused. So we're gonna be there on Tucson, and that's the end of August up to September 1st.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the creating. Always interested to talk with folks that write across form, and that's something you do well. And glad to have you back anytime.
Sure, it was a pleasure.